For those of you who are new or haven't been here before, my name is Wendy Brooke, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the book club. I live in Alabama in the US, and my co-host is Sally. Can you introduce yourself, Sally?
Hi, yes, I'm Sally, and it's a bit chilly here in Australia, so I'm wearing my old lady fingerless mittens that make my partner cringe whenever he sees me in them. And I also have a message from our other co-host, Carolyn, who cannot be here today, and she has just asked that we read out an acknowledgement of country, is what we call it here in Australia. And she's asked me just to say that as we start, we want to acknowledge that wherever we are in the world today, the land where we are standing is the traditional territory of many nations, and we wish to acknowledge and thank the first peoples of this territory and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land in order for us to continue our work today.
Good, thank you. And also, because Carolyn's not here, she did have a couple of things she wanted me to pass on to everybody. Next month's book, which is What the Psychic Told the Pilgrim, it's by Jane Christmas. She had written, you might find an article, I'll plug that into the chat in a minute, about the book. She'll be interviewing Jane. She met Jane last fall in Bath. She's a Canadian who lives in Bristol, UK now. She just recently did the Camino again, and she wrote, I thought I'd tell you what she wrote to Carolyn. The Camino was grueling. We started at Cadiz and made it to Santiago de Compostela, but had hoped to go the extra 75K to Coruna. But by Santiago, I was totally done. About 1,100 kilometers in total. Just exhausted but fit. Haha, through the walk just was, as I was hitting my stride, I was attacked by a large dog who sunk his chops into my calf. Hospital, antibiotics, drugs, and orders not to walk around for a week. Once I got home, I needed another round of antibiotics. I'm still having issues with erratic swelling, so I'm pissed at the dog and its owner, but hey, stuff happens when you travel and you just have to adjust and pivot. During our next month, I will not be here. Sally will be here, as will Carolyn. I'll be in England at the time. But also joining us will be Regina Winkle. Regina Winkle Bryan from Bold Spirit Travel, and she's going to join us and share her Camino tips. So for those who don't know, the book, which is What the Psychic Told the Pilgrim, is about the Camino, walking the Camino in Europe. So we'll have somebody to talk about tips and tricks. So it should be a good, interesting program next month. And I'm sorry,
I'm sorry, Wendy, can you remind us of the author of that book again?
That's Jane Christmas.
Yeah, Jane Christmas.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I've been missing it, but I will be off in England doing some archaeology. So,
which is very exciting. I might also just add, because I will probably forget later. So this next book that we have, the Jane Christmas book, which is about the Camino, I have not yet read it, but I believe it's a really engaging, kind of quite a funny, entertaining read. The book we have after that is called Still Life. It's by Sarah Winman. And there are unfortunately a lot of books called Still Life, so try not to get confused and end up in one of the Three Pines books or something like that. Still Life is an absolutely beautiful, lovely book, but it is a long one. It's, I don't know, 480 pages or something like that. So we purposefully put the longer book after a book that's perhaps easier to read and a little shorter. So just those of you who need a bit of extra time to read it, just bear in mind that it will be coming. It's a gorgeous book set in Tuscany.
And the author again, Sally Jane?
That one is Sarah Winman, Winman.
Lovely.
But the next book is Jane Christmas's Camino book.
Yes.
And are there any books chosen after that?
Yes, we have one more after that. And I've just gone a bit blank as to what it is. I will find the link to that as well once we get to it. It has the list of all the books and pop that in the chat
Sally
as well.
Jane, that one is the seamstress in September.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, because I'm not here in July and I can't be on August either, because I'm also traveling, but I'm not doing archaeology. I'm going to play with polar bears.
Oh wow.
Fun. Oh wow.
I'm hoping.
Well,
So where
to
where
me-
exactly are you going, Sandy?
We're actually flying into Oslo in about
Oh.
10 days. And from there, we're doing a cruise through the Arctic fjords and all up through there.
oh, very nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
today we're journeying to Nigeria
Yes.
with a girl with a louding voice, and I don't know about you, but I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was for me. It was a very easy read. I sat down to read it and just couldn't put it down. I just read it the first weekend. So I read it so quickly and so long ago that I had to go back and reread it again to get ready for tonight. So for those of you who are new to the book club, basically what happens, I'll start by talking a little bit about the author. Then we'll start discussing the book. I have some questions, some prompt questions we'll talk about, and then we all just sort of share our thoughts and ideas. So a little bit, this book, it was very interesting to me. It is written from the voice of Adunni, and it's written by Abi Daré, and Abi grew up in, she's a young woman. This is her first book. It's her first attempt at writing, or her first published attempt. She grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and went to college for her higher education. Her mother actually was a strong believer in education, which we see that theme throughout the book. Her mother was the first female taxation professor in the country of Nigeria. And her mother laughs and says, well, I was probably the first female professor of taxation in all of Africa, but we'll just say Nigeria for today. We'll just call it Nigeria. But her mother was a very strong proponent of education. Not surprisingly, Dari has a law degree. She also, that from the University of Wolverhampton in the UK. She also has a master's in project management from a school in Glasgow. And she has a master's in distinction with creative writing. And this book came out of part of the end of her thesis work as she was doing her master's in her MFA. And she was encouraged by her professors. She had written like the first 3,000 words, and she was really encouraged by her professors to continue with it. She had started writing just as a fiction on a blog, and she was in the UK. She'd gone to the UK to study and gained quite a following in Nigeria. And people were really looking at her blog, and because it was, what is a Nigerian's experience going to the UK? And she got so much reinforcement about her writing, is why she went back to school and got her master's in creative writing. There are a couple of really interesting interviews with her online, and I'd suggest for anybody, just a very pleasant girl, nice interviews to take a look at. So that's a little bit about her. This is her first work. She has nothing else at this point, but hopefully she will be following it up with something else. So The Girl with the Louding Voice. If you're here and you did not read the whole book, that's fine. We love it if you have, but if you have not, feel free to chime in as you can with some of the questions. So let's start out with a couple of the early questions. Just have any of you been to Nigeria before? And was anything about the setting familiar or not? Anybody? Okay, Diane, yeah. Up, you're on mute.
There, but a long time ago, in '72. That's a long time ago. I lived in northern Nigeria at the time, which I would not go back to today because it's much too dangerous today. It was right after the war, the Biafran War. So there was military everywhere. But I did visit Ibadan and Lagos when I was there. And what I remember about Lagos, although the description is much more modern, although it may not sound modern to a lot of people, but it sounds much more modern than the way I remember it, although there were modern parts. But the frenetic life in Lagos was really there then. So I can just imagine being even more populated today, what it would be like. So the hustle and bustle was very, very familiar. And the various languages that I remember people speaking in different parts of the country came through the book. And it did make me want to go back. I wanted to go back a long time. It did want me to go back, but not to Nigeria because I think it's too dangerous. But it makes me want to go back to West Africa somewhere that it's a little bit safer. But it does call to me because I loved Nigeria. I really loved it when I was there. So yeah, much of it came back, but it's a very different Nigeria today. But her description of the village was much more familiar to me because we were in the northern part of the country and it was very, very rural. So a lot of, when we would go to the shoemaker, there was a guy who sat on the floor repairing shoes on the dirt floor, that kind of stuff in huts. The village right across from where we lived was really a mud hut village. So it did bring back a lot of stuff. I'll stop talking, but yeah, it did.
Very good. Anyone else? Yep, Kelly.
I just got back. I read this book in Africa. I just got back. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh,
I was
nice.
not in Nigeria. I almost made a side tour there, but I was in Ethiopia and Tanzania and then Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. But I like to read books of, places that I'm traveling. So when I saw this on the list, I thought, oh, perfect. I read it on 2 planes. I found it to be pretty easy to read and very engaging. And certainly, I think the 2 things that seemed familiar to it for me was I went to Ethiopia and there's not a lot of tourists in Ethiopia. I was just in Addis Ababa for a night, but my sons and I went to the marketplace and it was pouring rain and everybody was just scurrying, trying to cover their wares. And my son made the comment that, we don't go many places as tourists. He felt like we weren't being noticed. And I thought that was odd because we certainly didn't blend in. There were no tourists there. But he meant we weren't in a place like when we've been to the bazaar in Istanbul or in Egypt or something where it's all tourists and you're almost like a target and everybody notices you and tries to get you to buy things. They were selling like coffee beans and stuff. So being in the big city, I thought was cool comparing it to her experience. And then of course, driving through all the little towns in Tanzania, and we went to why am I blanking on the name of the people? But we went into one of the little villages, Maasai. So kind of had that big city and that village experience. And certainly you see that I've never been someplace that was so, and I've traveled a lot, but so completely different, so non-Western. And you see the women who are still dressed very colorfully and traditionally and are still carrying things on their heads. And of course, the roles are very traditional. And so, yeah, it was kind of cool to be reading it while I was there because you usually have male guides and there's always that female story you don't get to hear. And I've tried asking sometimes and everything's fine. The women love their life according to that. So you never really get to know.
You brought up the colorful clothing. Although I've never been to Nigeria, when I lived in Wisconsin, one of my friends from my church was a Nigerian family, and I worked with her husband, worked at the university with me, and I became very close friends with them and ended up going to many, many functions where I would be the one of maybe, be a lot of parties and that sort of thing, where I might be one of 3 or 4 non-Nigerians at the party. And what always struck me about them was the colorful, because they always wore the huge headdresses and the matching clothing. And to me, what struck me about this book that reminded me of them was the lilt and the voice, Adunni's voice, speaking in her broken pidgin English, which is what the author calls it, pidgin English, reminded me sort of that sing-song of the accent I could hear throughout the story, which I found interesting. So let's talk about favorite parts of the book. Now, for me, that was a little bit, trying to find my favorite part. There were several I liked, and I'm not going to quote. Normally I have a quote, but I think for me, one of my favorite parts of reading the book was when Adunni went for the first time to Big Madam's house, and her perceptions, as she was taken around the house, and like she went into the kitchen and there was this big white box that was making very cold air, which and the fact that when she saw all the books in the library, she thought, oh, this must be educated. Everything about it was so new and different, and I really enjoyed her innocence and wonder at seeing all these things and imagining what they all meant. So that was my favorite part. Anybody else have a favorite part? Yes, Elena. You're on mute.
I thought the author did a great job of adding description to the book. And that made the whole thing very rich for me. And as I mentioned in the Facebook group, I listened to it instead of read it. And it was difficult in the beginning to get the Nigerian accent, but it made it so much richer because the narrator was so great at changing voices. And just the little details that stick in your mind, like when she went with the second wife to supposedly go through this ritual to save her baby, she noticed that there was a goat in the yard. And then when she got lost coming back, how did she get back? She found the goat.
Yeah.
So it was just, especially if you're interested in writing, I thought that the way the author put in enough details about each situation, whether it was unfortunately the husband that she had to endure, or the description of the little old lady that she went to visit when she got so-called saved.
Yes.
I just thought the author did a great job with the description. And one of my favorite parts was the fact that the cook sort of adopted her.
Yes.
And helped her out. Thank God there was somebody. Not to mention that wonderful woman from that she first met at the party when she had the accident.
Yeah.
So
I think the descriptive nature of it to me made it so that I could actually see what she was seeing.
Exactly.
I was walking with her when these things were happening, even if it was in the terrible bathroom or hiding behind something. It's you're definitely with her. Anybody else have a favorite part? Yes, Sandy.
I think my favorite part was the whole relationship with the second wife and her. I mean, it just had so much. There were so many threads to it, and there was protection from the second wife to her and from her to the second wife, and I was really quite taken with that, because normally in those situations, well, normally I don't know a whole lot of them, but there's a lot of jealousy.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that jealousy. I saw, I need you I'm going to help you and you can help me. And I think that was really quite beautiful. And because of the stuff I do, just seeing them being taken in time and time again and being, brutalized and anyway, all of that stuff. But it's an amazing book. And that relationship just really, I was crying when she died. I was just crying.
I was so worried about what would happen to her children,
Yes.
her daughters. Because that was one thread that never really got picked up. But those daughters would have been without allies once their mother was gone and Adunni was gone.
Yeah.
That's the next
It
book.
was a special relationship.
That's the next book.
We
That
hope.
would be good. Yeah.
I think my favorite part was all of the women relationships. Like each one of those women relationships had something special that added to her life. And each one was different.
Yep. Yeah, Mary.
I love this book, and I had underlined so many favorite passages, but I love when we read the different books throughout this whole book club, the commonality, if we could put a Venn diagram with no matter what country that we read about, it's the human spirit. And this one passage that I underlined, it's right out the gate. It's like page 4. We have a TV in our parlor. It didn't work. Born boy, our firstborn, he found the TV inside dustbin 2 years back when he was working a job as a dustbin collector officer in the next village. We were only putting it there for fashion. It looks good, sitting like a handsome prince inside our parlor in the corner of the front room. And I was thinking, I've been in South America and Asia and in villagers' homes, and it's the same thing. People have pride in whatever they find, whatever they make, whatever. And, as human beings, we all want to present, a certain specialness about our place. So they had a TV that didn't work, but it looked good. And it touched me when I read that.
Yeah. Evelyn?
So something that Mary said, I can't remember if it was just before, I think it was just after I read this book, which I loved. I read Educated. Is that one of our books? It's the same book.
Right.
I mean,
Really?
it astounded me how similar many of those situations were. These are 2 women, young women, who live in as different contexts as one could imagine. And the books and their experiences are largely similar. I mean, they're similar to a large extent, I guess that's what I want to say. So I really appreciate what you said, because it's, I guess, unfortunately or fortunately, it's a universal truth that some young women are in horrific, unfortunate situations, and they manage somehow to pull themselves out of them, which to me was the takeaway from that book.
Yeah.
I read it quite a while ago, the book that we're talking about, Louding Voice. I loved the fact that she went back and forth between what we would call our English and her English. And it made the book far more engaging, for me anyway. And many of her experiences were the same as the woman in Educated. She'd never sat in a classroom. She never
I'll
had
have to
these
pick that up.
experiences. Yeah. Thank you.
And actually, you bring up sort of, Kelly. Kelly, you had something? Yeah.
I'm mute, Kelly.
Trying there. Sorry, for some reason it wasn't taking. I was just going to tag on with what some other people were saying about what they liked about the book. I thought when she got married so young, I thought surely there was going to be something that happened before that event that was going to change the course of the book. Once that happened, I thought, how is she going to get out of this?
Yeah.
This is it. Like, you could not see a way out of that. And I think one of the things I like about the book is that her life changes, and we could say it's her and her grit and her belief in herself. But in actuality, it's someone that took a chance and intersected in her life. That's what ultimately led her down a different path. She could not have done it herself. When she escapes and goes to the old lady, and the old lady takes a chance and gets her brother involved, even though that wasn't a great situation, that was step 1. She would have been caught and killed by the village.
Right.
If that hadn't happened. And then the next time is when I'd like to say, it was all women getting involved in her life, but actually it was the chef, the father figure, kind of, but more of a friend, but took an interest because he had a daughter who said, you should apply for this scholarship. And then ultimately she probably wouldn't have quite possibly even finished it, because she had doubts if she could, if the doctor's wife hadn't gotten involved. That's really what pushed her through and gave her the reference she needed. And so it was people intersecting in her life, not always at unrisk to themselves. That really is what made the difference. And I just always like that, because it's a reminder to all of us. You can take the easy path, or sometimes it's not that hard. These people weren't particularly risking their lives, but it wasn't an easy path. And what they did made that huge difference in who she.
Yeah, Elena.
Oh, sorry.
But on the other hand,
Thank you.
she was extremely fortunate, and you're right that she was so fortunate to meet people who helped her. But on the other hand, she was so curious and so interested in reading that she kept going back to the library and reading all of those things. And she could have gotten caught and beaten. Well, she was beaten all the time anyway. And so that when it came time for her to write the application, she had all that information to put in there and add to her story. And that was another aspect of the book that I thought was really good. The author did a great job of inserting those facts about Nigeria at the beginning of the chapter, you know, because she would have read that. And then there would be sort of an example of the number of child marriages or the lack of education or the corruption of the government kind of thing. And that's a very tricky thing to do, to put so much information into the book as well as make the story so fascinating.
You know, Ellen brought up, go on, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say we touched on the language, but if you noticed, it got better as it went along because as she was reading and teaching herself things, she learned more. And the other, I don't know if anyone's read The Color Purple.
Oh yeah,
but it's hard. It's hard to read. For some reason, I had less problem with this and the way it was written with the language it was than that. That was just hard. It was maybe I don't know why, but it just was.
You know, the whole idea of language is another one of the questions, because she uses unusual or idiosyncratic combinations of English words to tell the story. And did you find that as those expressions effective, or did you struggle to understand them? And also a question about which was your favorite. Now, before we answer the question, just want to tell you a little bit about what the author said. She grew up in a very educated household. And so she wanted to have Adunni to have the correct voice. And so she thought to the servants that worked in her house that spoke very broken English. So she tried to mimic it off of the servants that worked in her house and her 3-year-old child. She tried to get, she said, because sometimes she couldn't think of how it would sound right. And so she talked to her child about it and kind of combined those two together to come up with Adunni's voice. But what did you think about, was it an effective use of language? And as you noted, Kelly, it changes throughout the book. Yeah, Peggy.
So yes, I teach English as a second language at the local library. And it's always interesting to me to see people who do not have English as their first language, how they combine words, and like roofing my eyes. I knew exactly what she was doing, you know, but I would never say that. I had to roof my eye, you know, and it's fascinating that, you know, that combination. So I also tried to listen on audiobook, and I just couldn't. I had to see, I'm more visual, so I had to see the words, you know, as they were. But I enjoyed the way she described certain things, and you knew exactly what she was talking about, even though it's not an expression you or I would use.
Right. Patricia.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I totally agree with you, Peggy, on not being able to listen to the audio and needing to see the words. But by the same token, when I come across writing like this, if I read it out loud to myself, it makes a lot more sense sometimes. So with her voice, I did that sometimes where I actually read it out loud to myself, and then it filled in the gaps a little bit better than if I was just reading it. So I've done that before with other books too, and it helps.
I was blown away by the skill of the author in capturing Adunni's voice. It because you're right, Wendy, the voice changes, but you almost don't notice it changing. You only notice that it has changed. And her voice towards the end, it's not just that her grammar is better and her vocab is better. There is a confidence that comes. Her voice is louding, you know. There's that confidence that comes through in her voice. That it is so beautifully captured. And I was surprised at how Yeah, I love the expressions. I don't think there was a single time when reading it that I didn't know exactly what she meant.
Mhm.
You know, I loved when she talked about people stronging their faces. You know, for me, that is was such a great metaphor for when someone is frowning. It was beautifully done, and I just in awe of how the author managed to capture a voice, because it's hard to it's even hard to capture your own voice as a writer, and to capture a character's voice in this way without making it seem patronizing, which is often the case when you get dialect. It was beautifully done.
All right. All right. So what about marriage? How were her feelings about marriage different than those of her friend? And I'm not sure how to pronounce this. Inathan, her good friend that wanted, when they were childhood friends, and her co-wife and her co-wives. How did their thought of marriages differ?
But I think a lot of that had to do with her desire to become educated. And I think, I educated not only about book education, but about life.
Mhm.
And I think by her desire to be educated about life, she saw different, not in marriage, just different male, female, and just different relationships. And so she knew what she didn't want. And she'd seen it in her mom. Had her mom lived, her life would have been very different.
Yep.
Very different. So she saw it in her mom. And as she grew into herself and saw with these other two wives, she started to really see what she really wanted. And that's pretty common actually in parts of the world where child marriage is, the go-to. She was fascinating. She was strong. She was, she spoke loudly about a lot of things. Yeah, she was an amazing woman. And she was an amazing young girl who grew into an amazing young woman.
To me, I think part of it is that her view of marriage was that you could either be married or you could be educated.
Yes.
You couldn't have both. You couldn't, it was like being married was you do A, B, C, D, and that's it. Yeah, Evelyn.
I think that the perspective of marriage that she had took a lot of rethinking of what perspective we might have, because there was this whole thing about how it was going to help her family and provide them with funding and resources and this and that and the other thing. So it wasn't, to me at the beginning, it wasn't so much what she wanted, but how seriously she realized it was going to hurt her family, even though she didn't want to follow the marriage to this much older man. And I thought that was quite profound is the wrong word for such a young girl, but she was very clear to me. She was very clear in her head why she didn't want to, what she was not doing,
right,
as opposed to what her friend thought. Oh, I'm going to get married. My husband will take care of me, and we'll have chickens and we'll have goats and whatever. But to her, it seemed to me that it was the complete opposite perspective that she was taking at great risk. And, in the end, it didn't work anyway. But that's what set her on that course.
Yeah, it's almost as though she looked at it as being a sacrifice.
Yeah.
She was sacrificing
but
herself for her
family.
Right, for her family. Yeah.
For her family.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So
Whereas
there was that whole that whole development that I think I saw during the book of how she started to look at her world from her perspective as opposed to what other people expected of her. I think she hadn't even realized that that there was her perspective and that she was allowed to think about it. So that's
now
right.
Wife number two. Oh, go on, Peggy. I'm sorry.
I also think a lot has to do with how she was raised. Her mother sort of presented to her that this is a different future. She might have been
Yes.
in a culture where women or girls got married at 14, and that's what you did. Like her friend, you know, her friend's mother probably said, this is the best thing you can do, is get married to a rich guy. What could be better?
Yeah.
You know, whereas Adunni's mother said, no, get an education, you know. And then when she was exposed to the doctor's wife, who put out, you know, different ideas, and Adunni came up with, oh, we could electrify my village.
Yeah.
You know, I thought that was
What a
fabulous.
concept.
Like, that's going to win her the scholarship right there, you know.
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
get educated so I can bring light to my villagers, you know. I would have given her a scholarship, you know.
Yeah.
And light, not just light, but light.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
What's also very sad is, I mean, Adunni came from an appalling background, but it wasn't the most appalling background of the women that were in the story. So for Adunni, marriage to this man was a closing off of her options. I think she saw it as the end of everything that she aspired to.
Right.
For Khadija, the second wife, it was saving her from starvation. And you know, so which is awful, because it's like, oh, no matter how bad it is, it can be worse. But you know, with Adunni and Enitan, they both were in hard situations, and they had different views of marriage, because Enitan saw it as a natural progression and social status and a more wealthy husband. But for Khadija, it was the difference between that bag of rice
Right.
for her and her family.
And she was being threatened that if there wasn't a boy, she was going to be sent back home. And so
And the sad part of all of that is that's really the way it is in many of these countries. It just
Still.
sadly is. Exactly, still. So she's writing it from the perspective, but in actuality, sadly, it's true. It's all true.
Actually, I think Adunni actually got very lucky, because when she first was trying to escape from the marriage, and she was with her old lady friend, I honestly thought she was going to end up in a whorehouse in Lagos.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I was trying to picture her getting out of that. But so to end up being a housemaid that's beaten every day was actually a good thing, compared to what could have happened.
Yeah.
And that is reality. It's not fiction. It's real.
You know, one of the themes that and Sally was so good at coming with this question about human trafficking. You know, it's been kind of at the edge of a number of our books that we've read recently.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a little more vague. And so the question, you know, this whole idea of bride price is, you know, it makes it difficult to say, is that human trafficking when you have a bride price?
Yes, it is.
It
wouldn't go as far as that.
By United Nations.
Right.
Yep.
And unpaid servitude as well. So both of those really go into that human trafficking arena. But yeah, Sally, you were going to say.
Yeah, no, I would not agree. I don't agree. I agree that unwilling marriage with a bride price in situations like this, where I mean, these children are being sold into marriage. Yes, absolutely. But dowries and lobola, I'm South African by birth. You know, those are also rich parts of culture, which I think that we can, from an outside perspective, we can reduce it to saying it's selling people. But that's not necessarily the case, and that's not necessarily how people themselves view it. So yeah, it can be abused terribly. But I wouldn't just make a flat out statement that if there's a bride price, then there is human trafficking.
Right.
I mean, even the word bride price is our word that we use from outside the culture.
And I will agree with you on that, because, you know, I do think Adunni was sold by her father to her husband unwillingly. But I did have a long conversation once when I was in India about arranged marriages.
Yep. And
the way that this middle-class family described their arranged marriage is that it wasn't so much an arranged marriage as it was a loaded introduction, that the husband and the wife, or the potential bride and the potential groom, had a chance to get to know each other and had a chance to say, yes, okay, we're going to do this. Whereas in Adunni's case, she was like, no, don't make me do this. Don't make me do this. And so there is a very subtle difference at times between what we see as arranged marriage and what we see as, you know, being sold into servitude.
Mm.
And I think that I'm not aware, Sandy, of the United Nations definition of human trafficking, but my sense is that it also involves taking someone, a girl usually, but not only girls, boys too, out of their environment completely, sometimes to another country, which is a whole other level of crime against humanity, if you will. It's not that I'm not minimizing the fact that she was sold to this much older man so that her father could get whatever it was that he got, I can't even remember, against her will and so on and so forth. But I think human trafficking adds another layer of horror to it. I don't know what another word is for that.
I think and maybe because I'm so close to it, I just had a discussion with one of my volunteers who is from India and left her family because her father wanted to marry her off. And she had a choice. And this is in today's world, and she wasn't a child. It's all very subtle. And I think, I mean, we're getting off topic of the book, and I'm sorry, but I mean, many of you know how much I'm involved in this stuff. It happens to the kid next door. I can tell you, where I live in Toronto, I can tell you it's the kid next door. As well as those that are sent, I think her father wanted a new car or a new TV or whatever it was, doesn't matter, as well as those cases, as well as the cases where they're taken across borders. And it's just, and it's not just sale of a child, but the whole other side of it is that, she sold herself for a bag of rice. I mean, there are women in the world today who do this simply because they have to feed their children, and there's no other way to do it. So, I mean, we could be on all night on this topic.
It's a continuum, and it's hard. Sorry, Sandy.
That's okay. Getting back to the book, it was a really good book, and I also read it like really quickly. Yeah.
You know what? I have a comment. I think it's interesting that we discuss of the book of she's finding herself, she's empowering herself. It's a strong message. But at the same time, this still continues in Africa. So I guess what impact is that book going to have on people in Africa, like African society, saying, look, have a look at this book, let's empower the girls, because it's good in the Western world. We can read about it. We feel empowered. We're happy for her. But what good is happening in Africa to the girls who are going through that?
Okay.
There are programs going on in Africa, in Africa's like 54 countries. There are programs going on, I know, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in a couple of other countries. So there are programs, and as much as we say that, this woman that I was talking to, who's from India, she says it's happening in Toronto to the Indian, with the Indian population. So it's right here in my country, next door to me.
Yeah, but I think, and you bring up an interesting point. And I will say that, just again, from the author's perspective, she said that, I mean, first of all, this book has now been published in 16 languages.
Yeah.
So it's getting a lot of coverage in a number of countries. She said that, and somebody asked her, how is it being received in Nigeria? And she said it's very interesting because people look at it totally differently in Nigeria. And she said that, for example, her mother said, did I treat the servants well? That people are starting to, people that read it, their reaction has been, am I like that? And what am I doing? And so it's been interesting. She said it's been interesting that the reactions in Nigeria are much more subtle than they are here, but people they're reading and are questioning some of the things that go on.
Where my finger is. There I am. I think, and that's, you raise a very good point. I think it's also important to remember that none of this is going to change overnight. it's going to take generations and generations and generations. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, just because it's a humongous problem from our perspective, doesn't mean that each of us can't do something tiny to push the needle. Like I don't even know how small that would be, a nanometer.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of opportunities to help young girls in almost every country in Africa and in India and in many other parts of the world as well. So it's when you read a book like this, it's like, oh my God, we have to do something. And we do, but we can't solve it. Like not one of us, not even all of us together could solve it, but we can each do some little thing to help.
And those little things really add up, which is what I've learned. I mean, I was going to get rid of human trafficking when I first started this, that's like not happening.
Yeah.
But we've made tiny little increments. I work strictly in the hospitality industry, and we've made tiny little changes, and those changes are adding up.
Yeah, and they're important.
And so, a colleague of mine is CEO of the Mekong Club in Hong Kong, and this is all his work. And he said every little change means something somewhere along the line.
So I have a friend from Toronto, actually, who developed, I'm not even sure what the word is, this, I don't know if you remember when you were, I don't know how old you are, there were these sun reflectors, right? You just slather yourself in bain de soleil and sit out with this to get your skin darker. And it's sort of similar to that. And she adopted a village in Africa and brought these sun reflector bowls to the village so that the women wouldn't have to go and march miles and miles and miles to get wood for fires, so that they could boil water, so they could cook, so that on and on and on and on and on. The point of the story is, and I'm sorry to be so long, there was and they started developing schools and all kinds of other things. There was one little girl in the village who recently graduated from university in international affairs. I mean, I get goosebumps just thinking about it, but that's like one tiny little thing. And that young woman, it's the first person ever to finish high school, let alone go to university, let alone get a master's degree and what have you. So those kinds of things are possible. They just, we want them to be better.
I think also that, we need to, there are a lot of incredibly strong African women who live in Africa, who are from Africa, who are doing incredible work and have been doing for generations. And I think that we, while it is important that we are aware of these things and that we do what we can to help and to raise awareness and so on, it's not always that there are programs coming from outside that are making the most difference. It's also what people who live in these countries and have been working in these areas do that are important. And it's also important for us to look at our own countries and what's happening in our own countries. It's things do take the news, and it's important that they do. There was a mention in the book, early in the book, about the Boko Haram stealing the schoolgirls, and that was the flavor of the month here for a while. And I don't know what happened to those girls, but it stopped being news and it stopped being the headline, and we move on. But people who are living in that country are working steadfastly on those issues every day. But we should not forget to look around and just, we think it's just India or it's just Africa, and just look at what's actually happening right here in the hospitality industry, for example, you mentioned, Sandy, is something, we just don't even realize what that person who's putting food on our table might be going through.
Yeah, and I'm in Seattle, and every now and again they have raids at the airport. And they always discover unpleasant things about slave trade or sex trade. So it's quite active here, especially I think in, these nail parlors and massage parlors and God knows what else. But I agree with you, Sally, having grown up in South Africa, You know, things were so different at that time that you look back now and you say, how could we have lived like that? How could we have done those things? You know, as a little girl, what do you do when you're 5 or 6 and you see things happening to your nanny that are awful? And it's hard to judge in different contexts.
You know, and getting back, I want to get one more question in before we go, so we can maybe leave on a different, not quite such a down note.
Yes.
And that is, Adunni feels some sympathy for Big Madam. Do you? What are your feelings about Big Madam?
Some sympathy, and I was really happy to see that she had a little bit of a change of heart towards the end. It wasn't entirely change of heart, but Big Madam also was in a bad marriage, in a bad situation where she couldn't get rid of a husband. So Big Madam had some of the same problems that so many women do in other countries or here. So the dependence on having a man in your life is something that Big Madam had to struggle with. She had her own struggles. I felt for her.
Anyone else? Thoughts on Big Madam? At first, I did not like her at all.
No,
you know, but then as I started to get to know her situation a little bit better, I saw that she was trapped in her own thing. You know,
she was, but it didn't need to have cruelty.
That's
And
right.
that's where I can't get there, that I feel sorry for her. I mean, Adunni's mother was trapped in a loveless marriage where she couldn't leave and had no choices and desperately wanted to be educated, but she didn't beat her children because of that unhappiness. Like, Big Madam had choices, and even at the end, she would have lost face, and it seemed unthinkable to her to be on her own, but she could have done it. She chose to take her husband back. Yes, I understand how unacceptable that was culturally, but there was still a choice not to beat her staff. And ultimately, he was desperate. His sisters are begging her to take him back. He didn't have any place to go and he had no income. She really had the power. So it's kind of sad she couldn't have just, it was actually more about her social status than it was about, I mean, she had a daughter getting married, the horror of going through that as a divorced woman, and like, but I didn't feel sorry for her because of her choice to physically beat somebody, even though that was clearly acceptable to your servant. But I mean, like, she did it in front of other people, so obviously there was some level of acceptance of that.
And
I found it impossible to feel sympathy for her.
Impossible to what, Sally?
I just found it impossible to feel sympathy for Big Madam. I could not. I tried. I mean, I looked at Adunni, that Adunni felt that sympathy, and you know, I mean, yes, there was one scene where Big Daddy was beating Big Madam, which obviously is appalling. But yeah, it was interesting for me. And someone earlier raised something about the relationships between women, and there were some wonderful relationships between women in this book. But there was also how women had bought into the patriarchal system for their own benefit, and who abused other women and oppressed other women and dragged other women down to better their own situation. And Big Madam was the epitome of that. I could not warm to her in any way at all.
You know, to
I
me,
think
part of
also
it,
she was insecure. So when you're insecure, then you end up beating people because you just, you know, you're so insecure, you got to feel good and you put down other people so that you feel good.
you know, I think one of the first scenes when Big Madam met Adunni is she took off her shoes and had her rub her feet.
Yeah.
And you know, and although sometimes we say, "Oh, my husband rubbed my feet; it was wonderful," to me, having a servant rub your feet is kind of the lowest of the low. You know, I mean, that was really putting her in her place immediately. You know, is to have her rub her feet.
On the other hand, and I'm not trying to defend Big Madam. In some ways, she was, and I have to be really careful how I say this, she was expressing that she was putting Adunni in a position of complete trust. I mean, she trusted her to do something very, very, very personal. And You know, in some cultures, there is a belief that your soul is hidden in your feet are the beginning of everything else in your body. And massaging somebody's feet is a privilege. I'm not saying Adunni thought it was that. I'm not saying Big Mama thought it was that, but I think it's very hard to look at it only as abuse. There might be another side to it. And the reason she beats people, I don't know. I'm not trying to forgive her. It's terrible. She was probably beaten too as a child. You know, we know about that in Canada. We're going through that and will be for generations about with the Native people here who were beaten and they beat their kids and their parents were taken. It's a long story, but my point is that as horrible as it was and as unforgivable, there might be, if we went far enough back, there might be a little tiny reason that put her there. Doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's okay. I'm just trying to be
and I
sympathetic.
think, and I don't disagree with you, Evelyn. In fact, I probably agree with you, you know, to think it through. But oftentimes when this is perpetuated by generations, it's very difficult to get out of it. I mean, one of the questions I'm often asked, usually by hospitality students in college, is, well, why don't these mostly girls, sex trafficked and stuff, why don't they just leave? Well, how many women are stuck in domestic violence situations and they don't leave? So how do you expect a 14-year-old to? So, you know, mama, not mama, you know who I mean?
Adam.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. So we don't know what her past was, or how she, and when I look at survivors, with certainly this woman is a survivor, she made somewhere because she had things in front of her that helped her make the decision to move out of the situation. Not everybody has that. Not everybody has that.
No, her mother.
Well, yeah, her mother was the start of it.
Yeah.
But she had other things along the way. So we don't know what's inside of a person that makes them go one way or the other, unless they want to tell you and talk about it. So, I mean, I don't think I sympathize with her either, but you're right. We don't know what's in her past.
We don't know.
So before we close out, let's do a quick numbers. What do we think of the book? You put in the chat. 1 to 5 or 1 to 10?
1 to 10. 1 to
10 being the best.
Yeah.
Just put
is the best.
What do you think? 10 is the best. Yeah.
I've forgotten. I don't have my spreadsheet open to do, so I'm just quickly bringing one up.
It's all 9s and 10s so far.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, it's moving too fast.
Well, I would say just by looking at this, it looks like it was a success. It was a good book.
Yeah,
it was very good.
I'd say it was more than a 9. So so up there would Tell Them My Name in terms of our real successes.
And actually Called Them My Name. And yeah, that was another very good book. So all right, so next month. Patricia, yes.
I was just going to say, Tell Them My Name. I actually recommended that to another book club I have, an in-person book club here.
Brilliant.
They loved it.
Yeah,
they all loved Tell Them My Name, and I was so happy that they did because I love that book too. So anyway, I digress.
Good. So next month, Jane Christmas book on what the psychic told the pilgrim. It will be with Sally and Carolyn. And so I will see you all in 2 months.
Me too. So I'll be away next month. Yeah.
Enjoy yourselves and take care.
Thanks,
We'll
Wendy.
Yeah, it was lovely.
Bye. Second before you count on.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Average is 9.46.
All right.
That's pretty good.
Pretty
Thank
good.
you. Bye.
We should tell the author.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah.
Oh.